Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today from Boston, Massachusetts is Khatchig Mouradian, who is editor of the Armenian Weekly that's been published in Boston for decades. And Khatchig in that position has, in the last several years, has made Armenian-Turkish conversation, not just dialogue, cool, I think. I don't think that's an unfair statement, in that he has included Turkish writers, he's included coverage of Turkish events related to the Armenian issues, and extensive coverage of Armenian and other sites in Turkey, throughout Turkey, not just Istanbul. Khatchig, thank you for joining us on CivilNet. Is it okay to put that mantle on you?
It's generous, thank you.
But it's true. You have chosen to not discuss the simplistic issue of, genocide, whether it happened or not. You have chosen to say, by your work, both personal and professional, that we're kind of beyond that. And now the issue is, how do we talk from here forward? Is that fair?
Absolutely. I do believe that as far as the issue of discussing the genocide is concerned, that is a non-issue. It's not one that is up for discussion in any way, shape, or form. And, that discussion is currently taking place within Turkey between the progressive, the more open segments of society. And I do think that it is our role to push the discussion forward as we approach the centennial and talk about issues like memory, issues like justice, and how to move forward.
And you've been doing that recently in a whole new way. You've been working with Chris Bohjalian, the best-selling fiction writer in the United States, in the process of his book, The Sandcastle Girls, and now, hopefully, the process of turning that into film.
Yes, I've had a small role, which, again, Chris has been too generous in magnifying it, in helping him out with The Sandcastle Girls. And it has had a huge success, and I'm very happy about that. And hopefully, Eric Nazarian will be also equally successful in turning it into a motion picture.
And in that process, let's leave the motion picture discussion aside for the future, and as this thing rolls along, in the process of researching all of that, you were all recently in Eastern Turkey, Western Armenian places, and what Chris was talking about, and what I hope you will talk about, is that even the nature of these trips seems to have changed. You are now not just going to regions and cities and historic sites, but you're going to places that the French call places of memory, les lieux de mémoire. Talk about that. Talk about going to valleys where masses were killed. It's a different sort of visit and trip now, isn't it?
It is, and it all started when, a few years ago, when I started doing these trips. Our initial plan was to go to specific areas and just try to exhaust them, cover them as much as possible. But unlike many other such trips, what we did was we went with smaller groups, and we gave a lot of time. We actually devoted a lot of time to talking to the locals. I do think that that's also part of really experiencing these places of memory, and realizing how the locals interact with them and what stories they have.
With the places?
Yes, of the places and their interaction with the people who used to live in these places.
And what have you found? Tell us some stories.
Well, the most recent story that I published, I think, probably one of the most moving ones that I struggled with for months, was one of this man, this Armenian man, a survivor of the genocide. He was born in 1910. His name is Hovset. In 1915, he survived the genocide, and he was taken in. He lost his entire family. This is in Lice, near Diyarbakir. He was taken in by a local Kurdish family. He was brought up as a Muslim, did the pilgrimage to Mecca twice, had several children, and named one of them Talat. Now, back in January, I met Talat through his brother, who in fact right now has changed his name from his original Muslim name to Armen, and is learning the Armenian language, and is working at an Armenian institution.
Where? In Diyarbakir?
Diyarbakir, yes. So these kinds of moments where you interact with the son of a genocide survivor, who is named Talat, and his brother who has changed his name to Armen, really introduces us to the complexities of the situation. And I think it challenges us in the diaspora, because for the longest time, our definition of a survivor has been one who has made it, one who has actually left Turkey, survived the massacres and the deportation.
Yeah, the survivor is my grandmother, not anybody else. It's that generation.
We are losing those survivors around us. The people that my generation, our generation, grew up around. And on the other hand, in Turkey, people are discovering their grandparents, their survivors. And I think that confrontation, that meeting between us and them is quite powerful.
Do you remember when the whole process of genocide survivor interviews was very ongoing and active in the United States and other places? It was often very difficult to get these survivors to open up and talk about things they'd kept inside for so many years. Do you find that the children of survivors are more open in Diyarbakir and other places in Turkey?
Yes, it is. It does seem that for a number of reasons, including the easing of the political, the hardship, the pressures in Turkey. In the Kurdish areas, a greater openness, an even greater openness is also present. And I do think that they will push the discourse beyond what we heard and expected. That, generally, things like people coming out and saying, my grandfather was Armenian, my grandmother was Armenian, or I recognize the Armenian genocide. I think, these sentences, statements that we very much probably justifiably yearned for the longest time. I think we've moved beyond that, and other issues can be discussed.
I can imagine, and I've heard the complex ways in which some of these human stories are told. What is really fascinating is to hear you say that the local populations, whether with Armenian roots or not, are able to talk about places where horrific events took place and describe them, even though they weren't there, they didn't see them. That means that there is this continuing historical narrative there.
Absolutely, and the Dudan Gorge is one very good example of that. This is a place where the entire population, Armenian population of Chunkush, near Diyarbakir again, was taken, essentially stripped of their possessions and thrown into this deep gorge.
People thrown into the gorge.
Yes, thousands were killed there, and essentially, if you talk to the locals, every single one of them knows about it. I mean, you don't even have to bring it up. If you just say you're Armenian, many of these people will say yes, and you ask them, right? Are there any Armenian sites here? There was this man, on our most recent trip. We were talking to him, and we were asking about some Armenian sites there, and he said, of course, unfortunately, there's also Dudan. This is something you hear from every single person. Some people, everybody, it's part of the local, narrative, local. Of course, not everybody will be as open to talk about it, and even more, not everybody will be as open to talk about it on camera, but everybody knows it.
Is there a distancing between the teller and the story? In other words, I'm showing you this gorge, not because I had anything to do with it, but because, it happened. Other people had something to do with it. Is there how do I describe it, an apologetic tone, a distancing, an us versus them?
There is, Salpi. For example, in many cases, they will tell you that, well, this is what the Turks did to you, and then the Turks had you for breakfast, and then they had us for lunch. Or they would say things like, so there is always this attempt to blame the other, or even say, immediately say that, we have Armenian friends, we like Armenians, etc., that kind of distancing. But the other thing that I've realized, and we've worked with many drivers, right, at the beginning of our journey, the driver would be, essentially wouldn't be attached to these stories. And by the end of it, you would see them open up, you would see them really very emotionally involved and sometimes walking ahead of us to these sites. And I think that also shows how, some of the people who are on these journeys to places that are, not in the middle of villages, etc., are distant, right? You really have to hike up there to visit these monasteries, etc. That kind of connection with those places makes them more appreciative of the Armenian presence in these lands.
At the end of the day, these stories that you're hearing, gathering, telling, are they for you and me and our friends and colleagues, or are they for the population of Turkey? Who needs to hear these stories?
I do think that these stories are significant and important and valuable for all of us. And also, not just the stories themselves, but the way in which these stories are collected. I do think that the interaction with the locals, the interaction with the many of the hidden Armenians who would tell you, "Can I hug you?" Who would, who have that kind of longing, especially in distant villages that do not receive that many visitors, right? Who have this longing to reach out to an Armenian, who have this urge to prove to Armenians that, look, I am Armenian. And they would bring you documents trying to prove that.
What documents prove that?
For example, family documents, right? They would go to the, local, family records, and there are certain documents where you can clearly see, with the names of the grandparents, etc. And I can send you several samples of that. And it's amazing this effort for them to really reach out. And I do think in that sense, not just the story after it gets published, but the process of the story coming to life has a significant role for the people there on those lands and for us.
You just reminded me of something that an Istanbul Armenian said recently, as we were talking about 2015. He said, "Mezi aransin mitzekek, don't leave us alone." And it seems to me that that is even more relevant and applicable to the hidden Armenians that you're talking about.
Absolutely. It is in many ways this realization that, and it makes, personally, it makes me want to go more, more often. It's one of these experiences that when you see, women who are in their 80s and 90s, right, survivors or daughters of survivors of the Armenian genocide, and they tell you, "My blood is calling, let's give me a hug," or that kind of feeling. I think, it's worth the trip. There have been many times when I've turned around and told my friends, "You know what? After a moment like that, I would say, this is it. The trip was absolutely worth it. Only for that one hug with that daughter of one Armenian genocide survivor."
Well, that story also tells us how valuable the sharing of these stories is. And I want to thank you, Khatchig Mouradian, for sharing them with us through the Armenian Weekly and here on CivilNet.
Thank you, Salpi, and thank you, CivilNet, for this opportunity.
And thank you for following us on CivilNet.